It's not news that public transit in America sucks, especially when we look at other developed countries. In 2015, the number of public transit trips per capita in Europe is 4 times that of America, while Japan and Korea use public transit 8 times more. The rising cost of living in recent years has led to a greater discussion on the poor offerings of America's public transit systems. Buses don't come very often, and they're always late. But the biggest issue is that the public transit network in America are absolutely puny compared to those in Europe and Asia.
This issue has been covered by many media outlets and channels, including Vox, CNBC, Bloomberg, Wendover, and Not Just Bikes. Vox talked about how most American city transit systems only lead you downtown, and Not Just Bikes talked about the lack of transit-oriented development. But at the end of the day, they all generally agree on a few key points.
The obvious point, of course, is that American cities are built for cars. American governments are notoriously known for spending more money on bigger highways than on more robust transit systems. At the same time, private interests such as the infamous highway lobby successfully convinced American governments to abandon the once prosperous public transit systems across the nation.
Many seem to think that auto-centric development was not inevitable, and that our reality today is a result of decades of poor governance. After all, real people in governments and corporations throughout the decades made real decisions that led to more money in cars and less in buses.
But to argue that certain social realities were not inevitable requires 2 preconditions. First, the competition between various interest groups must have been free. An authoritarian rule, for example, removes any uncertainty in policy and everything becomes inevitable. The second precondition is that there must have been more than one worthy contenders in any given competition. For example, we won't say that the dominance of the iPhone-like designs in modern phones is orchestrated by Apple, because we all saw that the iPhone won out in a free market competition against other worthy designs from other big companies. So a key question to ask before we start pointing fingers at either the government or certain private interests is, was the auto-oriented development the result of free competition? Or was there really something fishy going on? I mean, if not investing in public transit is seen as such a mistake today, then why didn't we think so 70 years ago?
Even as early as the 1950s, it was estimated that 1 in 7 Americans worked in auto-related fields, including dealerships, services and maintenance, highway construction, rubber and tire factories, oil companies, gas stations, and of course car manufacturing. So the car centricity doesn't just benefit one particular private interest, but a significant group of Americans. But how did we even get here? And why didn't we also invest in public transit?
What I found might not be what you expected. As you might imagine, this is a massive topic that involves many different things from different times. For this reason, I have decided to split the entire video into 2, although both still end up being pretty long, but I hope you can bear with me here. The rest of this video will focus on the discussion within America and on the economic reasons for its notorious sprawl and failing public transit. The second video will then discuss the institutional reasons, and I will also compare America with other countries, specifically Canada, and why Canadian cities are almost always more transit-friendly and dense, despite the many cultural and economic similarities it has with America. In this video, I will talk about 3 stories about how American cities developed, including how streetcar companies facilitated suburbanization, how the upper and middle class abandoned city centers, and how trucks overtook the railway. You can skip ahead according to the chapter's mark if you like, and you can find all my sources in the description below.
In terms of economics, an important model that determines how transportation infrastructure is planned is the relationship between land prices and transportation cost. Economically, these 2 factors are in an inverse relationship that can be shown on a graph like this. In the city center, land prices are the highest because of their proximity to commercial activities, but here transportation costs are at the lowest. As you move away from the city center, land prices fall, but the transportation cost rises. The increase in transportation costs as land prices fall is essentially a trade-off made by land users, and those who choose to move out of the city centers are compensated for their longer commutes by being able to use more land and floor spaces. And because land is cheaper outside the city, more people can afford their own spaces, so density decreases. Up until the commercialization of the railway, all cities developed similarly. It was extremely expensive to move goods around by muscles only, so production-related activities must occur near each other, creating the city center. Since the upper and middle classes are often involved in whatever industry was prosperous, they were incentivized to live close to their work. For example, before the American Revolution, the wealthiest residents of Manhattan lived on the waterfront lanes, especially Dock Street at the southeastern tip of the island, where they could enjoy proximity to both businesses and the beauty of the Upper Bay. Throughout history, living in city centers have always been the luxury of the wealthy, while the outskirts of the city were often associated with slums and ghettos. And this lack of transportation technology is why older American cities developed similarly to European cities. New York, Boston, Chicago, and San Francisco feature much greater population density and offer a much more robust public transit system.
Even when cars eventually came around, these older cities had already become big enough to not only afford subway, but had also established a wealthy middle class that had grown accustomed to city life. The cities I just mentioned all built their first subway lines a decade plus before the first Model T came out of the line. And their city centers remain desirable to the wealthy businessmen to this day. But for cities that matured after the commercialization of the railway, things look a lot more different.
The commercialization of the railway is one of the biggest reasons why most American cities became a city at all. In the span of decades, many villages with barely any settlement became bustling trade hubs because of nearby train routes. But in terms of the relationship between land prices and transportation costs, the cities that grew after the commercialization of the railway differs from older cities in a very significant way. Because they are new and small, their land prices fall a lot faster as you move away from the center. At the same time, the convenient arrival of transportation technology means that transportation costs do not rise as quickly as well. The economic result of this is that density falls slower. Unlike the wealthy of the past, homeowners of newer American cities could afford their own private spaces that is removed from the chaos but not too far from the city. This is because the land surrounding older cities had already been turned into yielding agricultural land when industrialization began. So developers had to pay a higher price. But newer cities that sprouted only after the commercialization of the railway were not previously settled and were thus extremely cheap.
In other words, newer American cities developed in a way no other civilizations in history ever did. They expanded on an abundance of unoccupied land at a time when transportation technology was becoming increasingly available. This is a very distinct feature which only the newer American cities have, and a very important reason why American cities sprawled. Of course, this is only a macro discussion on a broad side of things. But more specifically, I want to tell 3 stories of 19th and early 20th American urban history that tells us more about the decline of public transit. What is interesting, though, is that you will continue to see the overarching theme of cheap land and low transportation costs across all these stories. The first story is about what the historians call the Street Car Suburb. I'm sure a lot of us has heard of the Consequential Highway Act of 1956 that suburbanized American cities and led to the downfall of public transit. But the suburbanization process actually began as early as the 1950s, which was facilitated by, ironically, the public transit systems of the electric streetcars.
The arrival of the electric streetcars during the latter half of the 19th century greatly expanded the size of the cities. Horse-drawn carriages before then were slow and unreliable, but electricity finally offers something that is much faster than walking and allows cities to expand at a consistent pace. Compared to railways, streetcars allowed the wealthy, upper and middle classes to be even more flexible with where they want to live whilst working in the city. In other words, wherever the streetcars would reach, land prices would rise. And this simple rule remains true even today.
But because America was established on an abundance of unoccupied land, the government adopted what was probably the freest land market in the world, and America was advertised to offer every man its own land. Land speculation was almost unregulated. By the end of the 19th century, the commercialization of the streetcars and the sewage systems and the power grid means that land developers can offer the rapidly growing American middle class both private space and modern facilities, things that were once reserved only for the city center.
However, land developers did not work independently. In fact, many streetcar companies were themselves land developers. They bought unoccupied land at extremely cheap prices, built new streetcar lines into the wilderness with the expectation that water and power lines would follow and land prices would rise. On a similar logic, many streetcar companies also built parks, beer gardens, and resorts at the end of their streetcar lines to promote the use of streetcars into a certain area. In 1902, the trolley system of Massachusetts owned 31 pleasure parks, and virtually all of them were on the distant edges of urbanized areas. And the first department store, what some might see as a hallmark of suburbanization, was also first introduced during the streetcar era. These types of projects sprouted all across America, and the country became not only one with the highest home ownership, but it also had the most profitable public transit systems in the world. Most of the streetcar companies were privately owned, yet they offered fares that were even lower than what you'll find in Europe. This was not because there was bigger ridership in America, but simply because these streetcar companies were also real estate developers. During the height of streetcars, the companies themselves became so hyped and speculated that St. Louis Transit, which had no real reason for existing at all because it had no tracks, no cars, and no physical facilities, was capitalized at $20 million in the 1890s. This is precisely why the government has always considered streetcars to be a private enterprise. Many discussions on the downfall of American public transit often refer to the case of Los Angeles because LA had one of the most extensive public transit networks in the world during the early 1900s. But in reality, it was these private streetcar companies that initiated and carried out the sprawl of LA. The greatest transit barons in LA was Henry Huntington and his Pacific Electric Railway Company. But while his network of red cars was world famous, he studied transit ridership to determine which areas appeal to riders and focused his real estate promotions there. He even operated water companies, usually at a loss, in order to encourage development in the desert-like regions.
So it's a bit inaccurate to say that governments abandoned public transit in America, since they were never in control of it, even when public transit was profitable. The second story I want to tell is about how the upper and middle class abandoned the city centers. Throughout American urban history, there's a very consistent anti-urban theme. Prominent American writers have consistently written about the downfall of humanity in the city and the redemption of the soul in the quiet suburbs. In fact, this rural bias can be found all the way back to the Founding Fathers, who had often envisioned a new country dominated not by cities, but by small towns and countrysides. During an 18th century epidemic of yellow fever, Thomas Jefferson wrote, "I view large cities as pestilential to the morals, the health, and the liberties of man." But it wasn't just a rich people thing. Home and land ownership has always been notoriously celebrated by the middle class, but it's not hard to see why. American cities during the late 19th to early 20th century was probably going through the most tremulous period of change in all of human history. As a country of only 100 plus years of history by that time, America was rapidly industrializing, meaning people were moving from family farms to organized labor in the cities. And during the decades of 1910, America was accepting more than 1 million new immigrants per year. Keep in mind that the entire world at this time had only just started urbanizing, and most people were only farmers half a century ago. So these newly urbanized middle-class people weren't just the first-timers themselves, but in the entire world. It's not hard to imagine why many reacted strongly against the intense movements and unfamiliarity in the cities.
Across the nation, everything from sermons to advertisements consistently promoted values such as the value of private space, the sanctity of the family, and the idea that home ownership means happiness and success. We can see these values in the iconic song from 1823, John Howard Payne's Home Sweet Home.
Home, home, sweet, sweet home.
Of course, another cultural factor that encouraged the escape of the wealthy is America's racial segregation, which became a much more prominent issue after the 1950s. Historians have observed that since the beginning of suburbanization in the 1800s, poor minorities moved into the cities while the middle class moved out. When the growing civil rights movement created more racial tension in the cities, there had already been a noticeable wealth divide between the city and the suburb.
Now, you might ask, why is this important? Well, although we might think that the wealthy has little to do with public transit, they're actually crucial to the sustainability of city centers and whatever public transit system it has. It's a common conception that rich people could care less about taking the train, and public transit is more for those who cannot afford driving. But that's not entirely accurate.
Surveys on public transit users in New York City and Vancouver have both shown that those who earn above the average income make up a third or more of all riders. In 2007, American Public Transportation Association published one of their largest surveys and found that 46% of riders come from middle-income households with annual incomes ranging from $25,000 to $75,000. And 69% of transit users own at least one automobile or light truck, and 45% had a vehicle available for use for that trip but chose to use transit instead.
But the most important link between the wealthy and public transit systems is through property tax. Successful public transit systems have to be run by the government and has to be partially funded by property taxes. And this makes sense. Those who live close to transit hubs and enjoy a higher valuation on their properties should pay more. But the move out of the middle and upper class means that a significant source of tax money is gone. Less wealthy people in cities means less people are able and willing to rent there, which creates a cycle that further decreases the tax money collected from the city centers.
This link between wealth and public transit is clearer if we look at the household income maps of different cities. Here is the income map of Vancouver. The pattern of transit-friendly cities is that the highest earning districts are either within downtown or not too far from the center. Here's New York City, and here's Toronto. A bit worse than Vancouver, but not too badly distributed. But cities with poor public transit systems feature a pattern of low-income households in and around city centers, while the highest earners surround them in outer suburbs. Here's LA, Baltimore, Miami, and this is most of Michigan. Remember when I said that slums are usually on the outskirts of older cities? Well, that rule has been reversed in American cities a long time ago, even before the arrival of cars. Now, Houston, Texas shows a different pattern but demonstrates a correlation between city center wealth and public transit in another way. Its income map looks different from LA, as the split is more an east-west split than an inner-outer split. But we can kind of see that its public transit network is denser in the direction of higher income earners, regardless of whether or not the government planned this intentionally. This tells us that the middle and upper classes are crucial to the sustainability of public transit, and their move out is a central reason behind the downfall of public transit in America. I will talk about the government side of things in part 2, and it will further support this finding.
In the move out of the middle and upper class, cars undoubtedly played a major role, which brings me to my third and last story, the fall of railways and the rise of trucks. The sprawl of American cities only began with the streetcars, but would not have reached its height without cars. After all, streetcars are still a form of public transit, and streetcar suburbs are built to be denser than the typical single-family home that we associate with American suburbs. The reason for this further decentralization to single-family homes is nothing other than the automobile and the extensive road networks.
Although the 1956 Highway Act greatly transformed American urban landscapes, the root of American road building projects can be traced back to the good roads movement that ramped up in the early 1900s. By then, cars had been in production in Europe for a few decades, but it was not until Henry Ford revolutionized car manufacturing that cars really became something that anyone can use. In 1915, Ford was selling more than 300,000 Model Ts a year, and by 1924, he had cut the prices to $240, which means that the average worker at the time could buy one in only 3 months' time. As you can see, car ownership had become an incredibly tangible dream by the 1930s. But a bigger problem, however, was that roads across America were notoriously bad. Streets in the cities were okay, but roads beyond the city limits were basically untraversable by anything with wheels. Most rural communities don't even have access to mail because the postal service simply couldn't get there. And when America decided to join the war in Europe, it took the goods from the Midwest military bases so long to reach the ports on the East Coast that the war had already ended when American trucks arrived in France. During the important decade of 1910, the federal government realized the importance of roads in the process of state building. Seeing the rising global conflicts between great powers in Europe, America needed to improve its mobilization and organizational capabilities. So in 1906, the federal government decided to back the Good Roads movement, and it launched the Rural Free Delivery Program, which ensures that all rural communities can get their mail, and sometimes even newspaper, delivered to their door, instead of having them pick it up in faraway city town centers. From the perspective of state building, this means that dispersed communities can be more unified with the national sentiments, and the government can mobilize the resources of these communities a lot quicker. In 1916, Congress passed the first federal legislation on roads, known as the Federal Aid Road Act of 1916. This legislation allows states to build roads with the federal government matching every dollar spent. Now, looking at the broader history of American road building, we can see a very consistent rule bias. The Act of 1916 and subsequent legislations from the New Deals in the 1930s and the 1956 legislation all stipulated funds for building roads outside of urban areas. It's not that the federal government wanted to undermine the roads in a city, but that they just never really cared about the cities themselves.
The biggest economic reason for this rather notable rule bias and the prominence of cars in America more broadly is simply because America is just too big. Contrary to what you might expect, the first Road Act of 1916 was not designed to help passenger cars, but to facilitate trucking. In fact, automobiles did not rise to prominence firstly as a private family car, but as trucks to haul things around. Some of you may have heard that by the 1900s, America had built the world's most extensive railway network. But what you might not have heard is that even such an extensive network was not enough for America's burgeoning market. For many American farmers, there might be a railway station nearby, but the network was certainly not enough to reach every farm. So truck rose in prominence not only as a complement to railway shipping, but also as a strong competitor.
It was observed in 1917 that rail yards in big cities were clogged up with cargo, as boxcars of tomatoes and turnips rotted while waiting days to be unloaded. Yet, at the same time, many farmers often had to throw away their goods because they lacked good roads to bring them to market. They called this loss the mud tax. In 1910, proponents of road buildings argued that while Europe was falling behind in making cars, America was suffering from bad roads. American farmers paid 21 cents per ton mile to haul produce over the country dirt roads, while French farmers paid only 8 cents a ton mile because of their superior services. And this was estimated to have cost the entire country over $500 million a year. The second reason for the stagnation of railways is advancements in technology and consumerism. Generally, freight railways are cheap to haul a lot of things from one location to another. During the early decades of industrialization, only factories and farms required these type of shipping services, and trains satisfied that need rather well. But as the economy grew and diversified, more and more people have enough money to spend on things other than food. And the advancing technology means that there's more to buy as well. Think the refrigerator and the radio. Growing consumerism means that factories were no longer the only destination for shipping goods, and businesses needed flexible shipping routes at flexible times that can carry flexible loads. By the mid-1920s, trucking had become America's largest wholesale producing industry, ranking ahead of giants such as gasoline, rubber, and meat packing. By then, this blossoming industry handed paychecks to 5 million Americans and attracted $2 billion in Wall Street money.
If we say that railways served as a significant economy booster in the 19th century, then we can say that roads took over that role in the 20th century. In a more general sense, in the early stages of development, the added value of products is low, so they are sensitive to transportation cost. Think coal or wood. Although railway doesn't offer the best flexibility, it is cheap. But in the post-industrialized economy, the added value of manufacturing increases, and the timeliness and personalization requirements of freight transportation are higher. And freight costs are not the only consideration by that point. From the 1920s and beyond, this is exactly what America needed. And we can continue to see this demand for flexible shipping in things like Amazon Prime services. The 3 stories I told in this video covers different things, but they all point back to the macro trend that I discussed in the beginning, which is the fact that America had so much unoccupied, cheap land, and it grew the most rapidly when transportation technology became available. So economically, the sprawl of American cities was inevitable, and so was the domination of cars.
In 1939, New York City hosted that year's World Fair, with the theme of building the world of tomorrow. At this fair, General Motors installed a display of what a future city will look like. It featured a 7-lane superhighway that cuts between skyscrapers and had a speed limit of 100 miles an hour. While it may seem like a dystopian world to us today, it was one of the most successful displays, and it attracted an estimated 25 million visitors because it simply appealed to the millions of American workers who dreamed of owning a home and a car.
But as economically inevitable as it was, there's no doubt that the dominance of cars and highways is becoming unsustainable today. Understand this history here helps us understand how we can set out to change things. And of course, the discussion does not end here. Canada faced similar economic conditions but feature more robust public transit systems And technically, America's public transit system only began to fail in the post-war period. Indeed, it was the Highway Act of 1956 that transformed American cities and launched the largest wave of suburbanization. To understand that, we'll have to look at the institutional reasons behind the downfall of public transit in America, which will be the focus of part 2 in my next video. I hope to see you all there.